Hi guys. So in this video, we'll be discussing about inheritance and its variations. Okay. So inheritance can be used in several other positions, but its usage varies from place to place. Okay. So we can understand like serialization is useful in a case of exceptions. It can be useful in case of overriding. It is useful in case of serialization. Okay. And in normal constructor chaining also, there also inheritance comes into picture. Okay. So let's suppose class A is there, class B extends class A, class C extends class B, class D extends class C. There is a chain of inheritance. Then how it will produce data. Then in case of multiple inheritance, so there will be so many scenarios in inheritance, and then the interviewer can ask you this type of question. In case of method overriding, how inheritance will perform. In case of constructor calling in inheritance, how inheritance will perform. In case of serialization, how inheritance will perform. So these all things we'll be discussing in this video. So let's get started. So let me share my whiteboard once. So first of all, we need to understand the first thing which we'll be discussing is normal calling of classes. Okay. So while inheriting one classes into another, so how it will print the data. So let's suppose I am having class A. Okay. Class A I am having. And class A, within that there might be some constructor present. Okay. And you are printing something A here. Okay. And then you are closing it. Then you are writing class B. Okay. Class B extends class A. Okay. And you are writing here B constructor. B constructor you are writing. Okay. Let's suppose you are writing SOP B. Then you are having class C, which extends class B. Okay. Then there is again constructor in class C, which is having SOP C. Okay. Like this, you have created three classes where class A is the main class or the super class. Class B is the subclass for class A, and class C is a subclass for class B. So like that, there is a link between all these three classes. So now if I write in the main class, let's suppose after that I am writing one main class here. Okay. So this is my, let me erase this once. Okay. So let me write my main class. Let's suppose I'm writing class main. Okay. This is my main class. And within that, I'm writing public static void main. Okay. And within that, I'm creating object for this class. Let's suppose I'm writing C obj equal to new C. Let's suppose I'm writing this line. Then what will be my output? So you will be thinking like I am printing class C, so I will get the output as C. No. Here there is a concept of inheritance. Okay. So there you can see like all the constructors are getting called here. Okay. So C will be called from B. Okay. And B will be called from A. So it's like a top-down approach. Okay. So it will directly search for which is the supermost class. Okay. And it will start printing from the SOP statements of the constructor of those superclass. So it will first go to the supermost class, which is A class, and will see whether is there anything printed in the A constructor or not. Yes, there is some functionality is going on. So we are printing A in the constructor of A class. So it will first give me the output as A. Okay. Then it will print me what? Then it will print me B. Okay. And then it will print me C. You will be surprised, like I am printing C object reference, then why we are getting ABC? So here only inheritance comes into picture. Okay. So inheritance doesn't mean that it will work only with C. It will just inherit all the properties of its superclasses. Okay. So let's suppose you are born in a particular place, okay, in a particular family. So you will inherit all your parents' property, and your parents are inheriting the properties of their parents. Okay, so you will be having the properties of your parent as well as your grandparents. The same thing you can understand it here as well. So you will get it from your grandparents first, then from your parents, and then from your side. Okay, so it will go in a top-down approach. The first class A constructor will be printed, then class B constructor will be printed, and then class C constructor will be printed. But if you are printing B obj equal to new B, then what will happen? If you are printing B object, then what will happen? It will print me again in top-down approach. First A will be printed and then B will be printed. C will not be printed there. Okay, because you are not considering C here. So like that, it will give me the output. So now what next? This is one of the concepts which we have discussed. And then certain other things also we have to discuss here with respect to exception handling. Okay, so let's suppose this this is the superclass. Superclass constructor is throwing certain exception. Okay, so let me erase this part once. Okay, this part I am erasing. Okay, and let me consider only two classes here for better understanding. Okay, the same thing will be repeated for others also. If you can understand for one class's property matching, then you can understand for other classes also. It will work in a similar fashion. So let me tell you, like, let's suppose class A is having a constructor, okay, and this A constructor is throwing certain exception. Or let's suppose A superclass doesn't throw any exception, B constructor is throwing exception. Some runtime exception it is throwing. Okay, so it's throwing certain runtime exception. Then what will happen? So let's suppose in the main class, I am calling this B. Okay, then B is having their own method. Let's suppose B is having their test method present. Okay, and A is having their own test method or some other sample method. Let's suppose some other methods are present here. Let's suppose sample method is present over here. Okay, then in the main class, you are calling class B and you are creating the object of that. Okay, and you are calling the, or you are, let's suppose you are not calling this test method, you may or may not call, it's totally up to you. But the main thing which I want to tell you is how this dependency creates an issue or how this issue will be resolved. So that we'll be discussing here. So let's suppose class A doesn't throw any exception as of now, and class B constructor is throwing runtime exception. Then what will happen? Will it throw any kind of exception or will it run perfectly fine? What will be the case? So here we have to understand, like, if in case of constructor, I'm telling, if a constructor is throwing certain exception, then what will happen? It will go in bottom to up approach. So what do you mean by bottom to up approach? So bottom to up approach means if class A doesn't throw any exception, then class B can throw any exception. Okay, any exception means any exception it can throw. There will be no issue at all. Okay, if class A constructor is throwing unchecked exception or any runtime exception, okay, then class B, any runtime exception means it can throw arithmetic exception, it can throw array index out of bound exception, index out of bound exception. These are all coming under runtime exception. Okay, and then in that case scenario, what will happen? A can throw any runtime exception, then B. If A throws any runtime exception, then B can throw any kind of exception or no exception. That means B can throw checked exception, unchecked exception, or no exception. So like that, there will be a pattern matching. Okay. So let's suppose now A constructor is throwing me a checked exception. Okay. So let's suppose it is throwing me any checked exception you can think of. Which exception can you think of? Okay. You can think of any checked exception like IO exception. Okay. So let's suppose it throws IO exception. Okay. So you have to write like A throws. First you have to write throws, then IO exception. Like that, A constructor is throwing. Then B constructor can throw what all exceptions. Okay. So here there comes a restriction. Okay. So whenever you can see like there is particular hierarchical structure and let's suppose there is a checked exception in, right, in exception there is a hierarchy of checked exception and unchecked exception, and within checked exception there are again certain hierarchies, like there is it comes under file not found exception. Okay, so within that file IO exception will be present. Okay, so first IO exception will be present, which is input output exception, and within input output exception there will be file not found exception. Okay, file not found exception, which is a subclass of this parent class IO exception. Okay, so that you have to understand. In case of constructor, what will happen? So if class B is a subclass which extends class A, okay, then if super class is throwing any exception, then subclass can throw an exception which is higher in hierarchy than the A class is throwing. That is the important thing which we have to consider. Okay, so if class A is throwing IO exception, then class B can't throw file not found exception. Okay, so let me erase this part. Okay, so now can you tell me, can class B throw file not found exception? File not found exception, I'm writing in short form here. Can class B throw file not found exception? No, because you can see that IO exception is a supermost class, and file not found exception is coming as a subclass of this superclass IO exception. So in case of inheritance calling for this exception handling, okay, you can see like it will not reduce its hierarchy. Okay, it can't go down in the hierarchy. It will always go up in the hierarchy. That is very important. So subclass constructor can't throw any exception which is lower in hierarchy as compared to A class constructor, which is a superclass constructor. So if superclass constructor is throwing me IO exception, then B class constructor has to throw any exception which is higher in order with IO exception. Okay, so it can throw checked exception which is higher in order than IO exception if it is present. Okay, otherwise what we can do here, we can change here. We can remove this IO exception. Okay, so let me write it again. So you can remove this and you can write it here. What we can write it here? We can write it here. Throws file not found exception. Okay, if A class constructor is throwing me file not found exception, so now it is at this point. So I can increase the visibility here. Okay, I can go in an increasing order hierarchy. So now what class B can throw over here? So now class B can very easily throw IO exception. There is no issue at all. So this is the concept which we want to tell you. There are two classes, okay? Class A and class B, where class A is a superclass, class B is a subclass, and class B extends class A. In this scenario, if A class is having a constructor which is throwing certain exception, checked exception, specifically checked exception I'm telling about. Because for any exception or no exception for runtime, okay, specifically for runtime or no exception if class A constructor is throwing, then class B constructor can throw any kind of exception. There is no rules and regulation of that. But rules will come into picture when class A constructor is throwing any checked exception. Okay, so there we need to see the visibility and hierarchy. So if class A is constructor is throwing any checked exception, then class B constructor can throw any checked exception which is higher in order, in case of exception hierarchy as it is thrown in A class constructor. Okay, so if A class constructor is throwing any exception, then B, which is a subclass of A, can throw that exception which can be same or higher in order. So class B can throw file not found exception. Same exception is possible, okay, but it can't go below it. That is very important. So if class A is throwing file not found exception, then class B can also throw file not found exception. There will be no issue coming, but it can't go below that. It always has to go above the hierarchy. The visibility has to be increased. It can't be decreased. Okay. So now class B constructor can throw higher order exception, which is IO exception. That is very important. Okay. So this was the concept that which we have been discussing here. Okay. So, but this order does not matter with help of runtime exception if we consider. Okay. So let's suppose we are considering certain unchecked exception. If we take, let's suppose I am taking index out of bound and array index out of bound. So array index out of bound is a subclass for index out of bound exception. Okay. So if A class constructor is throwing array index out of bound exception and class B constructor is throwing index out of bound exception. Okay, so class A constructor is throwing array index out of bound, class B constructor is throwing me index out of bound exception. Like here there is upper in hierarchy, so it will work fine. But if it goes reverse, then also it will not throw any kind of errors. It will not throw any compile time errors. Okay, so in case of class A constructor, if it is throwing me what? If it is throwing me index out of bound, and if class B is throwing me lower in hierarchy of runtime error. So let's suppose class B is showing me runtime exception as array index out of bound. Okay, so it is lower in hierarchy as a class A constructor is throwing. Okay, so there it will not throw any kind of compile time error because there are no such rules and regulation for runtime exception or no exception. Rules are there only for checked exception. That is very important to understand. So interviewer can ask you, if we are making use of unchecked exception and we are going lower in hierarchy, then it will throw any case of any kind of compile time error or not. No, that hierarchy order will be matter to you when we are making use of checked exception only. So this is the scenario for constructor. So now we have to understand with respect to method overriding. Okay, so let's suppose class B extends class A and class A property is getting overridden in class B. Okay, and that overridden method is throwing certain exception. Then how it will process data? Okay, so will it allow that exception to throw, or will it throw compile time error? Those things we'll discuss. Okay, so now let's go to next part. Okay, so now we will be discussing about, let's suppose there is a class A. Okay, class A is having certain method called test method. Okay, and within that test method, I am printing SOP. This is test method of class A. Like that, I am printing over here. Okay, and this is not a constructor now. Now I'm not talking about any constructor. Constructor is over. So now I'm talking about overriding concept. How inheritance works with case of overridden method throwing any kind of exception. Okay, so this is class A method, test method. Okay, and test method, if throws exception or not throws exception or throws checked exception, then what will happen, that we'll be discussing here. Okay, and there is one more class called class B. Okay, class B extends class A. Okay, then here we are making use of test method again. I'm overriding this method over here. Okay, you can understand, like I am overriding this method. Okay, and within that, what I'm doing, I am making some system.out.println overridden method. I can print like overridden method, anything you can print over here. Okay, and this method is throwing certain kind of exception. Okay, so let me erase this part once. Okay, so that I can write. So here what we can do, let's suppose class A method, test method, is throwing certain kind of exception or no exception. So first I will take into consideration case one as no exception. No exception. Okay, so no exception for superclass. If superclass, A class is superclass here. So if A class test method doesn't throw any exception, then class B test method can throw what type of exception? Yeah, so for no exception, what will happen? Let's suppose class A test method is not throwing any kind of exception. Then class B test method, what that test method can throw? What this test method can throw now? This is very important to understand. So if class A test method doesn't throw any exception, and class B test method can throw unchecked exception or no exception. Okay, class B test method can throw unchecked exception or no exception. Okay, but if let's suppose case 2 I'm considering, case 2 is class A test method is throwing unchecked exception. Unchecked exception means, unchecked exception you can consider like index out of bound, string index out of bound, array index out of bound. Okay, these all comes under unchecked exception. So if test method throws any unchecked exception, then what this test method of B class can throw? This B class test method can throw unchecked exception or no exception. Okay, any unchecked exception or no exception, class B test method can throw. Now case 3 I will consider case 3. What is case 3 here? If class A test method is throwing checked exception. If class A test method is throwing certain checked exception, what checked exception I can consider here? Let's suppose I am considering file not found exception, or IO exception I'm considering. Okay, I'm considering IO exception. IO exception is a super class of file not found exception. Okay, so in case of IO exception, what will happen? If class A test method is throwing IO exception, and class B test method can throw any exception which is lower in hierarchy than the super class test method exception. That is an important thing to consider. So whatever superclass method is throwing, if I'm overriding that class in that subclass, overriding that method in the subclass, then that overridden method of that subclass can throw that exception which is lower in hierarchy than that superclass test method exception. It can't go upper in hierarchy. So you can consider like it's an opposite of constructor exception. Okay. So in case of constructor throwing exception, what was the scenario? So if superclass constructor is throwing certain checked exception, then subclass constructor can throw any exception which is higher in or hierarchy or same hierarchy exception which superclass constructor is throwing. But in case of overriding, what will happen? It will go in a reverse order fashion. Okay. But only for checked exception, not for unchecked exception. For checked exception, if class A method is throwing certain checked exception, okay, and if class B, which is a subclass of class A, is having that overridden test method, that test method can throw any checked exception which is lower in hierarchy than that superclass test method exception. So that is very important to understand. Okay. So if class A test method is throwing IO exception, then class B test method can very easily throw file not found exception. Okay. But if class A test method is throwing me file not found exception, and if you are trying to throw IO exception from class B test method, then it will start throwing me compile time error. Okay. So that is very important to understand. So now let's understand through code how it is working. Let me show you a bit demo. Okay. So let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen now. Okay. So let me start from here. Okay. So this is child class, cc equal to new child class. If I'm doing cc.test, so it will print me child class data. So this is one of the concept. Okay. So it will start from the base class, which is a super class constructor, then it will print a subclass constructor, then it will print me the test method of child class. Okay. And here we have to consider like if super class and subclass is having the same method, test method, then it will consider the subclass method, but will not consider superclass method. This is a scenario when both superclass and subclass is having same method. Okay. If superclass and subclass is having different method, then it will subclass method will be hidden and you can't able to see subclass method in case of upcasting. Okay. So that is very important concept. Then we will understand this multiple inheritance concept. I hope you know as of now. We have to give the default implementation. If if one class implements more than one inheritance in the interfaces, then in that case, we need to give the default implementation, like which interface method you want to override in your class. Okay. So that will resolve multiple inheritance issue. Okay. So like that, we can resolve this. So we will start with the normal exception part. Okay. So we will see the constructor. So here you can see this is my base class. Okay. So if base class throws file not found exception, okay, and there is a child class which throws child class constructor is throwing IO exception. Okay. So what is the hierarchy now? If you can see the base class or super class is constructor is throwing me file not found exception. Where is file not found exception? File not found exception is the child class of IO exception. So we are going higher in order. Okay, so here you can see child classes constructor is throwing me IO exception, which is higher in order than file not found exception. Then will it throw any kind of error? No, you can't see any kind of compile time error. But let me do the reverse order. Let me try to reverse its order. Let me do it here, IO exception. First, let me copy this and let me write IO exception. Okay. See, it started throwing me error. Okay. Why it started throwing me error? Here you can see child class is throwing me IO exception, and in the base class, no. Actually, it was doing for the first time. Actually, it didn't compile that time. So in the child class, if you go and if I do file not found exception, okay. If I do file not found, see, it started throwing me compile time error, unhandled exception type IO exception. Okay. So from this, you can consider like you have to go upper in hierarchy of that exception hierarchy. Okay, you can't go below the hierarchy. Okay, the visibility has to be increased. You can't decrease the visibility. in inheritance. So what is the meaning of this exception, unhandled exception type IO exception? It simply means that if base class throws any kind of IO exception, which is not file not found exception, then my subclass will not be able to handle that. So that's why it's showing compile time error beforehand only. Like if I'm trying to run this, and let's suppose some other kind of IO exception is coming, which is not a part of file not found exception, then all load will come upon the superclass, because subclass will not be able to handle that. Okay, so that is very important. So that's why the property here is we have to increase the visibility in the exception hierarchy. We can't decrease the visibility. That was the reason. Okay, so here you can see as soon as we try to reduce the visibility in the subclass, it started throwing the compile time error. Okay, so this is the important concept which we have discussed it here. Okay, I hope you have understood the concept, how it is working. Okay, so now let me reverse it. Now superclass is throwing me file not found exception. Okay, so if you see here, if I am keeping both same exception, then it will not throw any kind of error, compile time error. That means we can keep the same exception, there is no issue. But when we are going up and down, then the issue will come. Okay, so base class is throwing me file not found exception. Okay, and then child class can throw any exception which is above file not found exception. So IO exception is the exception which is above file not found exception. So if you save, you can see there is no issue at all. And from main, you can, if you run it, you will see the output will be coming proper. This is base class, which is, it will first print the superclass constructor, you already know. Then it will print the child class constructor. Okay, and then it will print me the test method of child class. It will work like this. So this is the concept of inheritance with respect to constructor. So now inheritance with respect to overridden method throwing exception, that will be showing here. So here you can see there is a superclass method. It's a method which throws IO exception, and there is a child class overridden method. Okay, same method I have written, which I have written in the superclass. Now it is throwing me file not found exception. So what I did here, I have reduced or increased the visibility. Superclass is throwing me IO exception, and child class is throwing me file not found exception. So in the child class, what we did, we have reduced the visibility. So it is not throwing me any kind of compile time error. But the same thing, if we were doing with the help of constructor throwing exception, that time it was throwing me compile time error. So it's like a reverse. Constructor exception and overridden method exception is working in a reverse rules. Okay, so this thing we have to understand. So for demo purpose, let me change it. Let me throw IO exception here. Okay, so it will not throw any exception as of now, because all exception is same now. Okay, let me change to file not found exception. See, it started throwing me error in the child class. See what it is throwing. Exception, IO exception is not compatible with throws clause in superclass.method. Okay, so it's not compatible. So now you can understand, like, you can't increase the exception hierarchy. You can't go into increasing order of exception hierarchy in case of overriding. Okay, so if there is an overridden method which throws any kind of checked exception, again, checked exception, I'm not talking about unchecked exception. So it is a homework for you. You have to try it out for your own by testing unchecked exception. It will not throw any kind of exception. Okay, so it will not throw any kind of error if you are checking for runtime exceptions, runtime error, or unchecked exceptions. Okay, so checked exception was very important, which almost all interviewers will ask you. Okay, so this was the important thing which we need to discuss with you. So if we are not throwing any kind of, so here you can see, like, it is throwing IO exception. Okay, so here if it is throwing child class throwing IO exception, it started throwing me compile time error. Why? Because we are trying to increase the visibility in the child class. Okay, you're trying to increase the visibility in a child class, which is not possible. You have to reduce the visibility. That's why it is showing me compile time error. So now let me reverse it. So now exception is gone. So now in the superclass, what I will do, I will throw IO exception. So now you can see there is no error. Okay, so now I have not created main class and tested because it will work normally. Okay, so it will first print superclass constructor, then it will print subclass constructor. Then you have created one object of any class and it will just print a method of that class. Okay, so it will work in a similar fashion. But the main motto of this video was to show you the various varieties of inheritance. So inheritance with respect to your constructor exception, constructor throwing exception, inheritance with respect to overridden method throwing exception, inheritance with respect to multiple inheritance concept, how it will work. Okay, and inheritance with respect to your flow, like in top-down approach, how it will print with a constructor data. Okay, if class B extend class A, class C extend class B, class D extends class C, then it will print in top-down approach from A to D constructor. It will print. Okay, so in top-down approach, it will print. So there are 4-5 concepts which we have to remember. Okay, while implementing inheritance concept, because these concepts are getting asked most frequently in interviews. So I hope you got a concept, you got a clarity. So I'm not doing it for unchecked exception that is being given as a homework for you. You have to do by your own. Try to do your unchecked exception by your own and try to test it out. Okay, how it is working. Okay. We will see you in the next lecture with certain new concept. Till then, keep on revising the concept and crack the interview. Bye bye.